Breakthrough.
Well, this is Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. And as always, I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here alongside my co-host once again, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back with you.
Hi, great to be back on with you, Eugene. I don't know why I said hi like I was answering the phone.
Well, you know, it's good to give a strong greeting.
Yeah.
Well, you were greeting all of our fans.
Hi, that was just a very odd, yeah. I apologize for that. But it's good to be back on.
Great to be back on.
We have another great
obviously,
show.
Yeah, a lot of things going on around the world. Tragic times in many places, tough times in many places, and of course, the lead news story. Woo! There you go. Lead news story obviously continues to be the ongoing war in Ukraine between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, also, of course, playing a major role there. And we will be getting into a whole range of things here on the show today regarding what's happening there. Of course, updating you to the extent we can on some of the things that are happening now, talking about some of the broader implications of where this thing could be going, delving into the ongoing and increasing issues of censorship, going, of course, for quote-unquote Russian media, but even starting to go beyond that in ways that I think are pretty worrisome. We're going to be talking about sanctions, the impact of sanctions, certainly in Europe, in Russia, in the United States, all around the world, and also just some of the geopolitical implications for everyone really coming out of this. Are we in a new world era? Is this the collapse or decline of U.S. hegemony? What does that mean for countries around the world, for popular movements? So plenty for you here on the show, as we always do, which makes this a good time to remind anyone, wherever you may be, to go ahead and hit that share button so whoever's following you can follow us. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the bell so you can get the alerts, because we're going to have all sorts of very interesting things coming out here on Breakthrough News regarding certainly Ukraine and Russia, but also many other topics. So if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and wherever you are, make sure you hit that share button so whoever's following you can follow us. And you can, as always, put some money in the super chat. And if our censor, speaking of censorship, Rania Khalek, deems it to be read-worthy, we will read your comment. We will certainly thank you as well. So thank you in advance, of course, to anyone who's in the super chat, but also to let you know that that is available for you as an option.
And yeah, of course it's available. And just because you mentioned the term censorship, make sure you subscribe. I know Eugene already said it, but it cannot be emphasized enough, because I am, of course, convinced that YouTube hates me and hates us and doesn't want you to see our content. So make sure you subscribe so that regardless will end up in your feed, I hope.
Yes, I agree with that. It's the safest way to make sure that you see everything that we're doing here at Breakthrough News. So turning to the state of the conflict, of course, the big topic that has been discussed all day as it concerns that are the peace talks that were taking place in Turkey. The foreign ministers of both Russia and Ukraine were present. Now, there are a range of different elements to this. The most notable headline was that there was no permanent agreement reached in terms of ceasefires. And in many ways, it seemed as if it was pretty much a stalled session in terms of moving forward on any of the demands in a substantive way from either side. But I do think that one thing that's deeply notable, and we'll come back around to this, is the substance of the discussions seem to be around Ukraine's proposal for neutrality. And of course, neutrality for Ukraine not joining NATO is a major sticking point for the Russians. So it does show that there, if no exact progress, there's at least perhaps the shadow of an end game, but we will get back to that. The other major issue that has been batted around in the press are the accusations regarding what sides are alleging in terms of a hospital being hit by fire in Mariupol. There are conflicting stories about this. Ukraine is saying that it was a deliberate attack on a hospital, on a civilian target, and this is, of course, being promoted in the West as the escalation by Russia to deliberately targeting civilians. The Russian side is denying that they were targeting any civilians directly or that they are targeting civilians overall, not just in this circumstance. They say this hospital was being used as a staging ground and that it wasn't actually being used for civilian use. So there's dueling claims, but nevertheless, that has led to a much broader conversation around this issue of quote unquote atrocities and so on and so forth, and a escalation of rhetoric. So, that's more or less where things stand in terms of breaking news, as it were, or where the conflict stands, I think, in terms of the actual military movements. There hasn't been as much in the past couple days. There's been more of a focus in the past, I'd say, 36 hours, let's say, on the evacuation of civilians. The mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, is saying about half the city has now been evacuated and left. Millions of people have now left Ukraine, over 2 million, I believe, at this point. I don't know if we're 2, 3, but that was also a major issue being discussed earlier today, is the impact and the fallout in terms of the refugees now and who's going to pay for all of the housing and food and other things that are going to need to happen to take care of people. So that's another issue that's out there. So, that's more or less where we are, Rania. But I think, I raised the issue of rhetoric in particular because, you brought this up to me earlier about how it really does seem like the past couple days there really has been an escalation in the sort of rhetorical accusations flying around the conflict.
Indeed. And, a lot of it reminds me a bit of Syria, actually, because it's the rhetoric is just, first of all, a lot of it's coming from Zelensky, right? He's saying whatever he needs to say and whatever he can say to try to rally support for sending more weapons to Ukraine. I mean, his country's been invaded. He's doing, I guess, his job. And also try to rally support for a no-fly zone, which is essentially calling for World War III and potentially nuclear-armed confrontation between nuclear-armed powers. But today, yesterday after the hospital incident, he started using the term genocide, which I was actually quite surprised by. Of course, if a hospital was hit by the Russians, that's as much of an atrocity as when a hospital in Yemen is hit by the Saudis, or when a hospital in Iraq is hit by the Americans, or in Afghanistan or in Somalia or any of the other countries the Americans are bombing, but we don't care about it because they're not blonde hair and blue eyed. But anyways,
right.
Aside from that point, just the rhetoric I'm seeing and then just the way the entire capitalist media immediately jumps on whatever terminology is being used without even asking questions. I mean, the term genocide is a very serious term. We are, I think, 2 weeks, about to be 3 weeks into a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So to use the term genocide to me just seems really extreme and outlandish for the international media to just repeat. But when I see that word being used, the reason for using a term like genocide is to try to garner support for more war, to intervene, to try to garner support for military intervention by the US or NATO. So we have to be very careful. This is not to say there aren't atrocities taking place. Look, it's a war. War is very ugly, and that's why we oppose war, because war is the worst thing that can possibly happen, especially when it's between two countries. And in this case, several things can be true at the same time. It can be true that Russia hit a hospital. It can also be true that there was armed people near that hospital. It's a war. Russia invaded a country. There's probably going to be armed people defending against that invasion everywhere. A lot of things can be true at the same time. The point is we don't know. And when we don't know, for people just to be throwing around accusations for sure and saying a term like genocide seems deeply suspicious to me in terms of like a PR campaign to take us down an even more dangerous path that could escalate this war further.
No, I think that's exactly the right point, and we are at an inflection point. And I think whether there's going to be significant more escalation or whether there's a path out of this, whether there's an end game. And I mentioned it at the outset, and I think this is, really one of the questions is what is the path out of this? And obviously, and I mentioned earlier, the issue of neutrality becoming a central topic in the discussions, certainly in Turkey, but, prior to that being a major issue. And before I go into this, I just want to play a clip from Zelensky a little earlier this week talking about this issue, sort of the first time he was willing to admit, or relatively recently, it wasn't earlier this week, I think it might have been the end of last week, about the issue of neutrality and one of the first times that he actually really said that they were willing to discuss this.
Ми не боїмось говорити з Росією. Ми не боїмось говорити про все. Про гарантії безпеки для нашої держави. Не боїмось говорити про нейтральний статус. Ми ж зараз не в НАТО. Але які при цьому у нас будуть гарантії? І найголовніше, які конкретно країни нам їх дадуть?
So you can see there, talking about the issue of neutrality, raising the issue really, and this came up again in Turkey, of who's essentially going to secure their security. Sorry, that's a little redundant there, but nevertheless, who are going to the parties that are not Russia, I guess, that they would also trust in Ukraine, that can make sure that neutrality isn't just a fig leaf for capitulation. That's how Zelensky's putting it. But I think that's a notable factor, Rania, because it speaks to, what really is the main issue in some ways, and that is whether or not Ukraine is going to be a launching pad for sort of an anti-Russia agenda, the NATO agenda of turning Europe into essentially a trench. So, to me, it just feels like at the very least, it has some glimmer of hope that at least the conversation is now starting to turn on what are obviously sort of key final status issues. Like, obviously, if this thing is going to be resolved, the issue of neutrality in Ukraine is key. So, I mean, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but I am taking a little bit of at least the possibility of there being a path out, that this discussion is taking place.
I mean, look, there's absolutely a path out of this, and that is that Ukraine is Russia's neighbor, and Russia's security concerns need to be addressed. Some of them are legitimate, and this one in particular is. The problem, and this war didn't have to happen. Obviously, it didn't have to happen from the Russian end of things, but also Russia warned this would happen, and even Western officials warned this would happen if NATO continued to expand, and especially if Ukraine was made a part of NATO. And we see that Ukraine became basically a de facto part of NATO. And at this point, especially with Zelensky saying things like, willing to discuss the issue of neutrality, that's important. That's a positive sign. The question is whether the Western countries will continue to flood Ukraine with more weapons and give him a reason not to compromise. Because the more weapons they put, the more money they spend on arming Ukraine, the more weapons they give the Ukraine, the less likely Zelensky and the Ukrainians will feel they need to compromise, because they'll think they have the West on their side. So that is actually the kind of like spoiler aspect to what the West is doing right now. By flooding Ukraine with more weapons and escalating this war, they're essentially guaranteeing that any sort of compromise will be delayed, because essentially that's what's going to end this, right? Wars don't just, wars end, yes, with winners and losers, but they end with some sort of political compromise. And the longer you throw weapons into this, the longer you delay that compromise. So it's really kind of like in the West's hands in a way to how much longer this war is going to go on.
I think that's such a good point. And, something that French President Emmanuel Macron said recently, which I, want to bring up here. And I think this is notable, especially because, when we say stuff like this, Rania, allegedly we're just saying Russian talking points. But he said, it's impossible to build a lasting peace if Russia doesn't participate in building a comprehensive security architecture on our continent, because history and geography mandate this. Our responsibility is to preserve all the ties that we can preserve. Now, it's very notable, and I say that because I want to use it as a segue into a clip of Joe Biden, because, I mean, this is what we were saying in the lead up to the war, Rania, that there is an off-ramp, but, of course, once the invasion took place, you had all these Western politicians saying, oh, well, there's no way we ever could have prevented this. And now after, we've already had all this tragedy, you have these Western politicians like Macron talking about, oh, well, if we make Russia a part of the security architecture, we can, perhaps solve this. Well, if you would have done that 40 years ago, we never would have been here. And that's why I want to go to this clip of Biden, because, of course, at the State of the Union, he made such a huge deal out of, well, there's nothing we could have done. Putin was going to do this anyway. There was no way anyone could have predicted anything else. Anyway, I think this is an interesting clip from, I believe, 1997.
I think the one place where the greatest consternation would be caused in the short term for admission, having nothing to do with the merit and preparedness of the country to come in, would be to admit the Baltic states now in terms of NATO-Russian, U.S.-Russian relations. And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military, in Russia, it would be that. So the way I look at the calculus here.
So, of course, the Baltic
Wow,
states
it's-
did enter NATO, but
It sounds to me like Joe Biden needs to like apologize for his past spreading of Russian propaganda, because I've been told, Eugene, the past 2 weeks that suggesting that NATO expansion had anything to do with Russia's decision to launch a war is essentially Russian propaganda. I
Yeah.
guess Joe Biden doesn't know that, or maybe 1997
or Emmanuel
Joe Biden
Macron,
doesn't know that.
or Boris Johnson
Or
in his
Emmanuel Macron.
op-ed in the New York Times, who said Ukraine is not going to join NATO in the foreseeable future, and it's just like, okay, so Biden, Johnson, Macron, you all seem
was
to
also
know
the
very
current
clearly exactly
CIA.
what was going to happen.
The current director of the CIA, who
William
showed
Burns,
his comments in WikiLeaks, last week. I mean,
I know.
lots of people on Vladimir Putin's payroll.
Potentially a way out of the thing, and that there is perhaps a way to prevent it. And I think it shows how cynical and hypocritical many of these leaders were, that they wouldn't double down on these kind of statements before the war starts, and now they're laying it out. But anyway, it does show, I think, that there is a path out. But I think, as you also said, Rania, and I think very important, we shouldn't get too excited, because the issue of escalation is still, very much with us. You've got the issue of sanctions and how far that's going to go. Germany, I think we might have a headline here from Bloomberg that we could bring on the screen. But, you can see there Germany sort of taking the role they played slightly before the war, but trying to stop some of the escalation in terms of sanctions. They don't want the EU to go as far in terms of banking sanctions. There is a lot of consternation around whether there's going to be deeper sanctions on oil and on gas. And so even though the European countries are sort of generally singing from the same hymnal, you can see behind the scenes from headlines like this, there's a battle over how far to really drive this thing. And then you made the point about the no-fly zone, which I think is right. And this is something that Zelensky actually spoke to recently. I think it was on ABC News. Let's play Mr. Zelensky here if we could.
As you know, the president and NATO have said no to this no-fly zone because of concerns this could trigger
the reality is that setting up a
much wider conflict, a much bigger war than what we're seeing already, because there would have to be a willingness to shoot Russian planes out of the sky. Do you understand that concern?
What do you mean to shoot down Russian planes? If the missile is flying, yesterday, for example, the missile hit the university in the city of Kharkiv and the dormitory, and the same missile hit the tumor pediatric clinic in Kiev. So if this missile is flying, so are you thinking whether to shoot it down or not? I think there is no any other answer but to yes, they need to be shot down. You have to preserve lives. There were simply kids there with tumors. And in the university, there were ordinary students. I'm sure that the brave American soldiers who would be shooting it down, knowing that it's flying towards the students, I'm sure that they had no doubt in doing so.
Посилюйте санкції проти держави-терориста. Визнайте її, нарешті, державою-терористом. Знайдіть спосіб зробити безпечним наше українське небо. Зробіть те, що ви можете. Те, що ви повинні. До цього зобов'язує велич.
And that second one was from the Parliament of the United Kingdom.
This is so unbelievably irresponsible what he's saying for a few reasons. And I mean, okay, so if you want to limit the amount of suffering in your country, what on earth makes you think a conventional war between two nuclear armed powers in your country is going to cause less death and less suffering than right now? I mean, it's actually shockingly, it's unbelievable what he's requesting. And just based on like a selfish point of view, a nuclear holocaust that originates in your country will literally wipe out everybody in your country. So more than just the people who are going to be killed by the missile that you want the US to shoot the plane down that's shooting, more than those people will be killed. Your entire country will be annihilated. Like, it's just so insane that he's going around lobbying for this from Western governments. This is unbelievably reckless. And I will say, he's not doing this on his own. We know from the New York Times that several lobbying firms in the US are offering him their services right now free of charge. I don't know which lobbying firms are, but we know it's happening. And I can almost guarantee you that they're attached to the weapons industry in the US. So just the fact that the most hawkish elements of the capitalist imperialist system are pushing for a policy right now that, and I don't know, do they really want a no-fly zone? The fact that there's so many Western leaders saying, no, we don't want one. Maybe it's just to get more weapon systems into Ukraine, to make higher profits. But regardless, they're pushing for an insane policy that could actually lead to the end of the world.
Yeah,
like, there's
Wall
no
Street
other way to
Journal
put
had
it.
an editorial today basically saying that they should take the risk of, well, they're really talking about the so-called Polish planes, but really more or less saying, you got to call Putin's bluff. Like, is he really gonna launch a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapons attack? And, essentially more or less that pressing the thing a little bit further into direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is not as dangerous as people make out, and trying to create this whole sort of gray area conversation that is out there. But yeah, I think the point that you're making is very well taken, Rania, that, even people who are very hawkish are, talking about the no-fly zone and the potential implications of the no-fly zone. I know that the foreign minister in the United Kingdom was talking about this recently. And I think we might have that clip. I'm not sure if we do.
No-fly zone would lead to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. And that is not what we are looking at. What we are looking at is making sure that the Ukrainians are able to defend their own country with the best possible selection of anti-tank weapons and anti-air defense systems.
And I agree.
So yeah, you really have this major tug of war, around so many critical issues. So even though I think, that's really where we are, we have, the possibility of a path for peace. We, I think, have an understanding of what that takes from the point of view of neutrality, from the point of view of, addressing security concerns on both sides and having the right guarantees and guarantors, and all those different sorts of pieces, and then bringing Russia into some sort of security architecture, whatever that may be, inside of Europe, something that's collaborative and collective from a security concern. So we have that there. But then we also have this battle demanding more sanctions, no-fly zones, more weapons, threatening 10-year insurgencies that are Afghanistan style. So it really does feel that we're at that sort of inflection point on it. We saw that with the Polish planes episode, that was rejected. And this is a headline here from the Business Insider, right. But that, the Pentagon and then ultimately the State Department as well sort of reverse course after saying they were doing this, saying, no, we cannot have Poland, no matter what the modality is, send us MiG-29s that we then send to Ukraine, because they're probably going to fly out of somewhere close by. Does that invite an attack on a NATO country? Whatever, how is it going to be perceived by Russia? And then again, do you end up in a nuclear war? So obviously no one arguing the Pentagon isn't extremely warlike. So if even they are saying this is pretty dangerous, to me, it says a lot about where we are and about how critical it is that people raise their voices about, having peace, because it really could go either way.
Right. No, I agree completely. And I know that, real quick, I think that there's been a few super chats that we should acknowledge, because we do appreciate the super chats.
Yes.
Thank you to Sion Mesfin. We really appreciate the euros. While they still have some value. Sorry, that was mean. Wow. Just we're going to be talking about that soon, though. We're going to be talking about the sanctions on Russia and some of the boomerang impact, particularly on Europe, later on in the show. And then we also had a very nice donation from Martin Hernandez, or is it Martine? I think you always say Martine. Some bucks for freedom fries and Kiev mules, as they've changed the name of Russia, or, the Russian mule to the Kiev mule, or the Moscow mule. Sorry. Then we have Lucretia Williams, who is saying that sanctions are economic warfare, which we absolutely agree with. And again, we'll be getting to that. And then we have JD, who asked a question. I'm not sure if we can really get to it now, but to what extent is the tug of war over influence of Ukraine about exploiting its natural gas reserves? But I don't know if that's something that you want to take on now, or maybe we can get to that later. And then just another one from None OYB. Thank you both. How Russians are being treated is exactly how Japanese were treated in World War II. I mean, we're getting there. The level of Russophobia right now is so insane. And I think that's maybe a good segue into our first guest, Eugene, if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And shout out to everybody. And we're very happy to be joined once again here on the show by a good friend of the show, Zoe Alexandra, who's a journalist and co-editor of the great People's Dispatch. Zoe, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for asking me to join.
Well, very happy to ask you to join. I know one of the things that you all have been focusing a lot on recently in People's Dispatch is the media crackdown, censorship, fallout here. People have probably heard something about it, Russian media, this, that, and the third is being taken off air. But before we get into some of the implications, I was hoping you could just give us a sense of what we're really seeing on a global scale in terms of this suppression of various forms of media.
Definitely. Well, a couple of days after the military operation started, the EU announced that they would be placing a ban on RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik. And I think it's interesting. I just want to read the justification they used, and we can get back to kind of what it means after. They said these outlets will no longer be able to spread lies to justify Putin's war and sow division in our union. Following that, Sky News of the UK pulled RT and Sputnik. And then in the US in the past week, RT America, which is again a brand of RT and not, has a separate company, TNR, was shut down. It's still unclear what is the motivating factor behind this. Was it funding that was cut? Was it related to sanctions? There's actually not clarity on this. And then, all Spotify, Apple Music, other podcast platforms have pulled most shows that are made and produced by journalists who are some way associated with RT, associated with Sputnik, and other outlets. And I think the ban does not only cover Europe and the UK and now the United States, but there have also, Rania, you said last week that in Lebanon, you also can't access RT, in South Africa as well. It's banned. So there's like a formal ban in the EU, but that has kind of had this ripple effect into other countries. And, for here, for example, I use Telegram a lot because I find it nice as a platform. And RT channel just says that it just shows no content, and it says that it violates local laws. I don't know which local laws, and they don't really provide explanation. But then, for example, the Sputnik channel is available. So there's a lot of murky waters right now. And I think, when we finally get the files about how did this all go down and what laws were passed or what these backroom negotiations happened to do this complete media silencing, I think we'll get more clarity. But as of now, that's what I know. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Zoe, it's also interesting because we saw a kind of escalation in the way that social media, before they started just outright banning these outlets in certain countries, Twitter and Facebook started have been labeling anything that's either Russian affiliated or Chinese affiliated media, I think Iranian as well, as such, though none of those labels seem to apply to any of the many media outlets affiliated with either the British government or the American government or the German government. But one escalatory measure was they actually started labeling individuals. I saw a couple weeks ago, people who just work at RT or work at Sputnik or or work at CGTN now have that label on their bio, they're actual people, human beings, and their own personal Twitter handles have that label. And I've noticed that hasn't gone away since an outlet like RT America has shut down. It just seems to be escalating. It just seems like they're keeping that in place, almost like a scarlet letter to be like a warning for others. I don't know. What do you make of that? The fact that they actually started labeling individuals?
Definitely. I think it was very chilling. For example, there's a comrade that we work with, Marco Teruggi, who he's an independent freelance journalist, writes for a lot of outlets, and he's done several reports for Sputnik. And, as if anyone knows how freelance journalism works, it's not really like you have a fixed contract for many years. You usually get a story done. And he had done a bunch of stories for Sputnik, and he got slapped with this Russia-affiliated media tag. He ended up actually getting this removed because he raised it to Twitter, and it was removed. But I think a lot of other people, and especially in these outlets that have actually been shut down, have not had this label removed. And I think it's very concerning because what is the criteria with which they do this? For example, myself, I've been on By Any Means Necessary, a great show on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C., which has also been moved from all of these platforms. So does one for having participated in one of these radio shows? Like, what is the line that they're drawing? What does it mean to be, they're not really being clear with what it means to be funded, what it means to be supported by these governments. So it's quite dicey. And I think what all of this shows is that it's setting a very dangerous precedent because they don't have, essentially this is being done by these massive media companies, all based, by the way, in Silicon Valley specifically, that of course respond directly to the diktats of the State Department of the United States. They are not controlled by any citizen body. So they're just taking these decisions. They don't have to respond to anyone. They don't really have to respond to any specific laws. They can slap on these labels to whoever they want. And so I think, when people are pushing back and saying, yeah, but it's necessary because, then we know who's like feeding us fake information. And it's like, that can be flipped in a day. And so I think it's setting a very dangerous precedent. It's silencing these voices. I think these bans have also seen like an enormous amount of shadow banning. So for example, even trying to use Google to search these outlets is also becoming impossible. If you type in CGTN on Twitter, their actually Twitter handle doesn't come up. You have to go to the link itself. It's like impossible.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a good point that you make there, Zoe. And it feels to me that this, does play into sort of the Russophobia demonization aspect of it because we have to do this because it's quote unquote Russian propaganda, as you said, sowing divisions, all these different things. And I mean, let's just say everything they said was true. I think as you're sort of alluding to, what would make that much different than a lot of American outlets that also have been tagged, telling a lot of lies, creating a lot of things. I for whatever reason, sometimes I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. I turned on CNN briefly, and it was Erin Burnett who was in Kiev. Anyway, she's there. It was like, I think maybe a day before the invasion or maybe a day after. And the moment I touched in, she was like, and I was just at a center and I was with these young teenage boys who are training their beautiful, soft, young faces getting ready to go out into the teeth of the... I mean, if that's not propaganda, I don't know what is. So anyway, it just feels that there is a double standard and some hypocrisy here about, Russia bad, everything else good, and it's just because of the nature of the country, not the nature of the content.
I think that's exactly right. And I think also what that line from the EU commissioner says, that sowing division in our union, then what is really the point of this ban? It's they need to hold a united front. They need to toe the line, which is clearly what they're, putting forth in their media outlets. They're not worried that the BBC is going to contradict the line of the EU in response to what's happening in Ukraine. And so I think they are clearly showing that they're afraid of any other perspective, any other opinion being broadcast. And that if the people of these countries actually get information which maybe contradicts what their governments are saying, that they're not going to be, blindly calling for a no-fly zone, which we're seeing today as a result of this media propaganda. They're not going to be saying, yeah, let's all go to Ukraine and fight with these neo-Nazi battalions. And so it's really important, whatever the content that's being, not whatever the content, but I think it's so crucial to get other views. And I think especially as a journalist, I feel that it's so important that we are able to access these outlets. I read the New York Times. I like to read these, I can't watch TV news. It's painful to hear these people speak sometimes, but it's so necessary to hear what they're saying because it gives you a window into their perspective. If you read the New York Times opinion section, you're going to learn a lot about what these war hawks are using, what the lines that they're putting forth to justify what's happening, what they're thinking about, their strategy moving forward. And so if, the EU is so concerned, then they should be, allowing people to have access to that, knowing what Russian propaganda really is. And actually, I think, Eugene, you mentioned this to me. There's this Political article that says, I think it's like why a healthy dose of Russia propaganda is good or something like that. And it's saying that it's helpful, actually. It's part of having an active citizenry, that people are able to interact with different ideas and debate. I mean, this is, a fundamental human right, access to information.
I think that's such a good point, and it raises, I think, another question that is also, you were sort of speaking to about how these labels can be slapped on anyone, but even beyond a label being slapped on you, just the possibility of your content, sort of shadow banning you, being on sort of lists where you're being suppressed. And I was going to say, Rania, that you were slandered earlier this week by Voice of America. I don't know if that's what you were going to bring up just now.
Well, I wasn't going to bring that up, but I was going to bring up you mentioned shadow banning, and I was going to bring up that even outlets, or I guess maybe search engines that had previously advertised themselves as being like the anti-Google, as in like, we're not going to suppress content. DuckDuckGo is what I'm speaking to. I think I'm not sure if it was the founder. Yeah, I'm not sure if it was the founder, but somebody in a senior position at DuckDuckGo, if not the founder, actually tweeted his support for Ukraine and said that they were working to basically push down Russia-affiliated media in their search engine. So it's like, and Eugene, you've made this point before of you can't even really depend on the alternative. Those that claim themselves to be alternative platforms, because they'll also just do the same thing. Because again, like Zoe, you mentioned, they're actually not, like, they don't have to listen to people. They're not run by people. They're private companies who will appease the U.S. government because they're based in the U.S. But to the point you were making, Eugene, we had this attack on Breakthrough, and me specifically, at Voice of America, which is American affiliated, in fact, CIA founded, if I'm not mistaken, and still connected, obviously, to the American government, funded fully by the American government. And Voice of America, of all outlets, was reaching out to Google and Facebook and asking, well, what are you going to do about people like Rania Khalek and Breakthrough News, who aren't actually affiliated with any government, but are still pushing what they call Russian propaganda? And why would they say that? Why are we pushing Russian propaganda? Because we're questioning NATO? We're not even questioning, we're talking about the context and providing the nuance that's necessary to understand how we got here, because you can't ever understand how to get out of a war unless you understand how we got here. And that's that line you were talking about, right? Like, what are the lines? What are the criteria? Because in that world that Voice of America is pushing, they want it to be so that we get pushed off of social media because we're saying things that are maybe inconvenient for the US government. But what do you make of that slippery slope of, okay, well, now we got rid of the Russia affiliated media, who's next? And it looks like we're next.
Definitely. And I think, there are precedents in US history for this happening. I think, of course, this is the first time it's happening in the digital age, with digital monopolies, with these media companies that have even more power than in the past, of where it would have to be, the US government silencing and censoring independent media. But this is not new. And I think you're exactly right to flag that this is something that really threatens all independent media right now. And that just because right now they're coming for, media projects that have Russian funding. CGTN is also being attacked. I think Chinese media is probably next up going to face these attacks. But it has happened in the history of the United States that independent media projects, left media projects, have been silenced. Already a lot of Breakthrough, I know, has faced a lot of shadow banning by YouTube, by Twitter, by different media platforms. How far will the U.S. government, take? What will they step in to do? It's unclear. I think that, with all the mystery surrounding what happened with RT, we don't really know what they're capable of with the media. How far are they willing to go? How much are they going to show? But it's convenient enough if all of our projects rely on digital platforms. if these platforms are very quick to, bow to suppression, that, well, this is, people can flag the content. There's many different ways to go about this, but I think it is really concerning. And we do have to look to the past to see how critical voices have been silenced. I mean, a lot of people are referring to McCarthyism right now because it is what's happening, that critical voices are being flagged as supporting the enemy. I mean, we only have to look to the case of Julian Assange, who is the first publisher to be charged under the Espionage Act. A lot of people say that his case is also setting a dangerous precedent. So if we see that a publisher who's an Australian citizen is going to be charged under the Espionage Act now with the excuse of war, I think all of us are vulnerable to this. And the line is very slippery. The slope is very slippery, as you say. And I think we really have to be prepared for this crackdown.
Well, I think that couldn't be any better put. I think this is a scary time, an important time, and another time to know that the only way to be able to follow the news you need is to follow people directly. Don't wait for it to get put in your feed. Go looking for it. Subscribe on YouTube, whatever you can do. Definitely check out People's Dispatch, which is one of the best news services out there, covering everything you need to know, in my view. But Zoe, as always, really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the Freedom Side and help us sort through all these complicated issues.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, one thing I want to mention before we move on, and one shout out to Braithwaite, by the way, saying it's a great show. And you know what? It's our fantastic followers, fans, listeners, watchers that help make it so. So shout out to you, Braithwaite. But speaking of which, one thing I want to mention before we move from this topic, Rania, is the Socials program, which we're very lucky to have the video version of the Socials program here on Breakthrough. They also have a podcast. The Socials program podcast this week interviewed Lee Camp, also a good friend of this show, who, of course, among many things, had a show at RT America, Redacted Tonight. He's been censored. Also, his personal podcast that was not affiliated with Russia is censored by Spotify. As Lee himself pointed out, he may be the most censored comedian in America, and that's actually not a joke. And, all of the horrible things that so many people have done and are not in any way, shape, or form canceled, but because he's a strong voice against war and poverty and militarism, he gets hit. But anyway, very, very revelatory to listen to the interview with Lee and what his take on all of this, I think, is really important. So I just wanted to shout that out.
Shout out to Lee.
Really unfairly targeted. Well, we want to turn to the issue of sanctions now, another critical issue. Very happy to be joined by our colleague, Kay Pritzker, Breakthrough News. Kay, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I know you've been following this closely, and I know there's so much to the issue of sanctions, and you'd probably be here for 3 weeks even listing them all. But, maybe to start, just give us a sense. I mean, how serious is this in terms of the impact of these sanctions? I mean, is this just around the edges, or is this more of an economic war?
Yeah, so in the words of the French economic minister, this is an all-out economic and financial war against Russia. He said that as he was unleashing these sanctions, which are largely being considered the worst sanctions ever implemented on any country. And he actually had to walk these comments back because I think they were too honest. But are they a form of economic war? Absolutely. The way these sanctions work is that they're designed to cut Russia off from the international financial system. And, I would argue, I think that these are as devastating or as sort of violent and destructive as an actual shooting war, if not more so because of how integrated the world financial system is today and the nature of these sanctions. So what was done to Russia is that a lot of prominent Russian institutions like state-owned enterprises, obviously their oil and gas sector, but also banks, including their central bank, were sanctioned. Their assets were frozen. They're also being barred from international credit markets, international bond markets, meaning they can't borrow and lend money. And of course, they're being forbidden from exporting goods. Notably, the exports of Russian oil are being forbidden. And this is huge. For those who don't know, oil and gas exports are 40% of Russia's federal income. So, almost immediately, like overnight, you're seeing just a major decline in revenue to Russian workers, to the Russian economy. You're also, this also prevents financing for a lot of institutions, a lot of banks where people hold their deposits. People are lining up outside of banks to get whatever is left of their deposits. And we've seen the price of the Russian ruble fall almost 50% in relation to the dollar. And, for those asking, well, so what? I mean, first of all, these are institutions that hire Russian workers. I mean, these are big employers in Russia, and people's wages overnight are being cut because 40% of Russia's revenue comes from a lot of these resources like gas. But also, for people like on fixed incomes, like pensioners, older people, anyone who basically gets paid in rubles, so most Russian workers are seeing the purchasing power of their wages decline. So immediately, goods and services that you're buying, your rent, groceries, all these things are going up in price. People are facing massive price increases. People are saying this could be a recession, as bad or 3 times as bad as the 1998 Russian financial crisis. So, the way it's being presented in the media is like, oh, these sanctions just target these, elite institutions, or it's just targeting Putin's inner circle. But really, it's targeting anyone who uses rubles, which is everyone in Russia.
Yeah, it seems really obviously, not seems, they're actually saying it's designed to crash and destroy the Russian economy. And we've had several comments from Joe Biden himself, as well as the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, openly saying that this is going to hurt regular Russians and basically punish them for the actions of their leaders, which is a form of collective punishment, which is what the US does to so much of the world. And it's horrible. But I also think, the boomerang effect of this, which we're starting to see the beginnings of, is also interesting, because right now the big talk is, oh my gosh, gas prices are going up. The barrel of gas is like increased dramatically. The price of wheat is skyrocketing. The price of fertilizer is skyrocketing. And of course, fertilizer and wheat, Russia's the biggest producer. Russia and Ukraine, in fact, are some of the world's biggest producers of these things. So we already see that we're seeing warnings that there's going to be a global recession even as a result of these sanctions. What can you tell us about that, Kay, about the boomerang effect of these sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the gas issue is huge, and the U.S. is willing to sort of sacrifice its own allies in Europe. It's willing to sacrifice American workers for this. I mean, Stephen Colbert went on his show the other night and he said, "Oh, well, I'm willing to pay $15 for a gallon of gas because I own a Tesla." But most people don't own Teslas, and most people are really concerned about gas prices. I mean, it's such a ridiculous comment, but that really is the attitude of the ruling class in the United States: is we don't care who suffers. We don't care. American workers should have to pay for this, and they should have to sacrifice for this war we want to wage for our profits, for our people, for our power and our imperial domination. They don't care that their allies in Europe, in Germany, are facing massive increases in prices. And obviously, what's not being talked about very much at all is the impact this is having on a lot of developing countries on the third world who are facing massive increases in the price of basic commodities. A lot of people have pointed out that so much of the world's wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. And, it ultimately goes back to the legacy of US imperialism as a whole, is that they're willing to sacrifice anything. They're willing to sacrifice everyone's lives, the fate of the world, if it means, just holding on to power, holding on to the world system for just another 10 years. But this really could also trigger a recession. I mean, there are a lot of people who hold on to Russian bonds, or there are investors who hold on to Russian bonds. I mean, these financial assets are all over the world. They're in people's investment funds, but they're also in people's like pensions and stuff. These are widespread assets, and the next bond payment on the interest payments on these Russian bonds is April 15th. And if Russia fails to pay, which is very much a possibility because of all of the penalties I described earlier, that could trigger a sort of snowball effect where then people, the price of these assets decline, people sell them off, and that triggers a larger sell-off of assets in the world economy. But yeah, the U.S. has never cared if they destroy the world over these, wars. That's what they do all the time.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, and I think that what you're saying is so true, Kay. The possibility of a domino effect in the financial system, probably not that well understood in a way, but if people remember 2008, that started with what was allegedly one bank, and sort of hermetically sealed thing. Everyone thought it was maybe just Bear Stearns, and then a couple others. And the next thing you know, AIG, which we're all thinking, I thought they sold insurance. They're involved, and you can see how then everyone gets roped in and pulled in. And one thing I'll just quickly note before I ask you the next question: this week we did also pass the highest ever national average gas price in America, topping 2008. So it shows where we're going. But one other thing I wanted to say, Kay, and I know that you've followed this in a number of countries. I mean, obviously, sanctions have a long history, and I think we've seen the impact of sanctions on so many other countries in the past. I mean, myself and others have often said sanctions kill. I mean, give us some historical perspective here, if you could, as well, about what we could be facing if this continues to drag on or deepen.
Yeah, sanctions do kill, and we're not just saying that as a sort of we're not exaggerating in any way. We have historical precedent for this. So there have been sanctions implemented on a number of countries, but the three that come to mind are Venezuela, Iran, and Iraq. And I can say personally, I've been to Venezuela. It's estimated that the sanctions against Venezuela have killed over 100,000 Venezuelans, killed through deprivation of food and medicine. Because the way the sanctions work, I mean, it's similar to Russia. They blocked the Venezuelan oil sector from exporting oil, where 90% of Venezuela's government revenue came from, which meant people's wages got cut, people got laid off, people, there were shortages of goods. And because of this, over 100,000 people so far, this is an old statistic, have died because they don't have access to basic goods that most countries rely on through importing. They don't manufacture themselves. They produce a good, sell it, and then buy it from another country. Venezuela is not able to do that. I remember when I was in Venezuela, I was shown this factory where the government had been building computers for school children. It was a very noble project. It was recognized by the UN as this project that was furthering education for children. And that project was completely halted because the sanctions against Venezuela prevented them from actually buying computer parts that they needed, even though they had already paid for these parts. So they had already made payments on these parts. Both parties were, had agreed to go through with this transaction, but because the United States said no, they were not allowed to do this. So that was who sanctions were crushing in Venezuela's people who want houses and education. In Iran, I mean, there's a clip of Rudy Giuliani, which I think will be put out in a segment that I'm working on, where he says people in the streets of Iran are trying to sell their internal organs for American dollars so they can feed their families. I mean, this is the face of sanctions. And then, of course, the most famous example are the sanctions against Iraq in the 90s, where these sanctions went on for years, and over 500,000 children died slow, painful deaths through malnutrition, through lack of access to medicine, because the U.S. decided, hey, Iraq is not allowed to survive anymore. 500,000 people, and there's a famous clip of Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State at the time, being asked by Leslie Stahl, this is more children dying than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. Is this worth it? And she says, well, it's a tough decision, but I think it's worth it. And again, this is the attitude of the United States. This is the attitude of imperialism. They don't care who dies. They don't care who suffers. So yes, sanctions kill. And we don't. Yeah, we've seen this happen before.
Sanctions kill, but they're apparently worth it. I mean, at the end of the day, this is worth it. Sorry, just for those who are like of a younger generation. I'm of course referring to Madeleine Albright, who, when asked on 60 Minutes back in the late 90s if the sanctions on Iraq that killed 500,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5, if those were worth it, she said, yes, we believe it's worth it. And that literally just epitomizes the entire notion of the fact that all of the suffering that comes with sanctions are considered to be a price worth paying for the American government to get its way. But that said, there's also, on top of the collective punishment aspect of this, there's also a regime change aspect of this, because the hope is that this will immiserate Russians to the point where they'll get in the streets and protest or topple, not just protest, that they'll topple Vladimir Putin. Which just speaks to like another deranged aspect of all this, is because that actually is I hate the argument that sanctions don't work, because sanctions actually do work, because the point of them is to actually make people suffer. But what doesn't necessarily work is using them to overthrow countries, as we've seen, that hasn't happened in Cuba or Venezuela or North Korea. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what part of the sanctions on Russia are about, is toppling a government you don't like, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that this is a crucial point. I mean, why is the U.S. doing this? Why is the U.S. killing so many people around the world? And it's for the same reasons they invade and bomb countries. And we really have to examine the sort of changing dynamics in U.S. imperialism over, its history. Let's talk, the last 20 years, for example. You start this century with the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, these carpet bombings, shock and awe bombings, and occupations and invasions. And, when we really think about the legacy of the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan, I mean, these really are seen today as, absolute failures and embarrassments of U.S. policy. I mean, anyone that voted for the Iraq war today is sort of ridiculed in U.S. politics as like, you had absolutely no judgment. You were just like, drunk off of war propaganda. So these really left a scar on the U.S.'s image, the image it tries to perpetuate as this protector of democracy. And you've seen in more recent years, in the last decade, especially with countries like Venezuela and Iran, you've seen a shift to this sort of humanitarian policy, or at least under the guise of humanitarianism, these sanctions, where they say, oh, this country is it's doing X, Y, and Z, we're going to sanction them. But really, like Rania is saying, the goal of these sanctions is not only to make people suffer, but to make people suffer so much that they blame their own government. They take their anger out on their own government and overthrow the government, which the U.S. has been targeting for years. Obviously, Vladimir Putin, the U.S.'s sort of demonization of the Putin government didn't start 3 weeks ago. It's been going on forever, and they've wanted to take Russia, the Putin government, out for some time. And the way they're going about doing this now that they have the excuse of this war, is to sanction the Russian people, essentially, and to cause so much suffering and cause so much mayhem that they blame their government. And this has been largely effective, I think, because sanctions are presented as this sort of diplomatic solution. They're treated as this like peaceful alternative to war, when they're anything but peaceful. And because of that, there's a lack of understanding in the U.S. population, in the European population, of the real nature of sanctions. People feel like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, but they don't really know what this means on the ground in these countries. And we have some reports actually on Breakthrough News that I did in Venezuela, where you can see the reality on the ground. And it's clear that this is a form of war. Sanctions do kill, and it might even be worse than war, because we don't treat it as war. We don't talk about it like war. We talk about it like it's diplomacy, when it's really not.
Well, Kay, really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side. And of course, this is another reason for everyone to make sure you hit subscribe, hit the alerts, follow us at BT Newsroom on all your social media platforms, so you can see some of Kay's upcoming reporting that's going to be on this issue of sanctions. But again, Kay, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And real quick, a couple people, Philby throwing some rupees in the chat, it looks like. Very good to have some folks from India on board, referencing, the complicated geopolitics that have come out of this. India, that has been taking what some would say is a pro-Russian line. Anyway, we can get to some of that and some of the geopolitics with our next guest, but also want to shout out to Don, asking an interesting question about what would the best outcome be now, and, more or less whether or not something similar to Minsk could happen, and whether or not Ukraine can actually accept these demands, and what would the West's reaction be if Ukraine made peace with Russia. So there's a lot in there, and I think that's a good segue into what we really want to talk about next, which are some of the changes and complications that are happening around the world, and what it all means for where things are going. And shout out to Connie as well. I see you just threw something in the chat, and so always very happy to have everyone with us. But let's go ahead and bring in our next guest. Very honored to have with us on the show, I should say, Manolo de los Santos, who's the co-director of the People's Forum and a researcher with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Manolo, thank you so much for joining us.
Always honored to be there with Rania and Eugene. Love you.
Well, believe me, the pleasure, excuse me, is all ours.
Eugene, you almost messed it up.
I'm doing it for the fans, and I didn't do it right. I'm sorry. Well, Manolo, obviously there's so much here, and I guess the first thing I want to ask you, maybe just to set the stage and taking a step back from just the immediate day-to-day of the conflict, I think obviously a number of people were caught off guard by this even happening. Now we're seeing all sorts of repercussions, and good, bad, and indifferent around the world. I mean, is it fair to say that we're in something of a new global era, like the post-Soviet Union unipolar era? Is it over? Am I being perhaps too grandiose? I mean, anyway, I've said enough. You see what I'm saying?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, on one side, we definitely have a new era that's being rushed in, I think, by force, with the fact that the US and Europe are probably more aligned and united politically than they've ever been. That the fact that NATO has been given a level of legitimacy and probably consensus by their populations and by the governments across the region to essentially terrorize the world. That era is being ushered in, and I think in ways that we still cannot fully understand or even foresee the consequences of it. On the other hand, you also see the fact that this war and this conflict is rushing and pushing countries like China and Russia to have to rely further on each other, to have to face not just the might of the US, but to face a world under sanctions together. Also, the reality that many more countries around the world are in their own ways, particularly in Africa, where I think we've seen most of this, is rejecting the US-based rules order. So yes and no, Eugene. The world is coming is probably not as friendly as some on our left flank would like to think.
Manolo, I'm curious too. One thing about this war that is interesting in the way it's covered in the U.S. is it's only covered from the European and American perspective. But obviously, it's being viewed much differently in the global South, and not necessarily like everybody's like, "Woohoo, go Russia!" But at least where I am, I'm in the Middle East. I don't feel the same level of like suffocating anti-Russia sentiment, even by people who love the West. It's just they're not that invested in this. I'm curious, you spend a lot of time in Latin America. What do you view the sentiment to be in Latin America about what's taking place? And obviously it's going to be varied because people have different politics in different places. But what can you tell us about how people in Latin America feel about what's taking place?
Well, I think the problem with most mainstream and corporate reporting and journalism, which is so different from the cutting edge work that BT and others are doing in this moment, is that for folks here in the US and in Europe, this conflict started this year. This is a war of 2022. I think for most people on the planet, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Arab world, who have been accustomed to dealing with the warmongering of the United States government consistently for decades now, well into this 21st century, already know that this conflict started many decades ago. That what's at play and what's at stake is much more complex and much more difficult to just denounce in one direction or another. I mean, I think most people around the world are sick of war, would be opposed to war. At the same time, most people around the world are against US bullying, are against the fact that the Russians have been encircled and encroached on for so long. I don't think anyone or most people would be glad that hospitals are being bombed, that people are being attacked in Ukraine right now. But I think people definitely are putting this into a broader perspective that places this as another element of what the US and quite right, the NATO project is for the rest of the planet. I mean, what we're seeing in Ukraine is what we've been seeing in Iraq It's what we've been seeing in Somalia. It's what we've been seeing in places like Bolivia. Is essentially U.S. imposed conflicts that ultimately we are the losers of. We are the ones who have to put up the dead bodies so that empire can claim victory.
You know, Manolo, one of the things that you mentioned that I think is a really interesting element of this is you know, the Russia and China having to cooperate a little bit more. I mean, you know, some who rightfully, I think, want to see a weakening of U.S. imperialism are sort of celebrating this, saying, well, this is so good for China because it means that, you know, on banking, on all these other issues that Russia has to work with China. And in a way, that's certainly true. But that being said, it also seems to me like it's a big challenge for China because, as we've seen from the United States, they're sort of making a very big deal out of this. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, talking about this. Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, talking about this, about how China is now even more under the gun of the United States. And there's, if you do anything, we'll come after you. So, I mean, as much as, you know, perhaps it may or may not be you know, good for certain businesses, it does seem like it's a very, very significant challenge for China as well.
I mean, I think part of what you said is very true, that essentially the U.S. is also encircling and encroaching on China. I mean, they have been already for years now creating the basis for new conflict with China. You know, in fact, I think most of us who've been organizing and talking about foreign policy from the U.S. would say that we all expected there to be hotter conflict with China than there would be with Russia at some point. But this is where we are now. I think that the illusions of some that somehow the Russia-China alliance can sort of operate magically or sort of, I would say, swiftly and succinctly is kind of off base. I think the reality is much more complex. I think we have to deal with the fact that even though, while China has successfully built a robust domestic economy that doesn't rely or doesn't depend on the US in order to run most of its operations, it is the complete opposite case in Russia. It is the complete opposite. The Russian economy was so interlinked with the European and US economies that for it to make a shift towards even cooperating more closely with China will take years to fully develop. I think the process by which Russia even begins to use sort of Chinese alternative methods and forms of trade and commerce will be much more complex and difficult. And obviously, the other element, which is that the threats of sanctions against Russia are not just against Russia. They are against the world as we know it. They are against all countries that seek to trade with Russia, including China. And from what we've seen in historical practice, obviously, China is a country led by a communist party that definitely has a political analysis and takes certain risks in standing by countries like Cuba and Venezuela. But we've also seen the practice historically of private Chinese corporations definitely not taking risk when it comes to US sanctions. If they have to choose between standing by Russia or getting fined millions of dollars and possibly losing all business with the US, I think many private Chinese corporations will choose to protect their US interests. And I think that's another challenge that we have to sort of be aware of. I think the birth of a multipolar world, which is something I think many of us want, or at least a world in which US hegemony is not the present force or is not the dominating force, will be birthed through a lot of, I would say, a painful and violent process. And we're not there yet fully.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. But I mean, at the same time, you know, I guess the harder thing to talk about is, and some people get upset about this aspect of this, but I think we have to be honest about it, is, do you think that this decision by Russia, what do you think it means for the anti-imperialist movement around the world? Is it a positive or a negative? How do you see it impacting? And it's a tough question, but how do you see it impacting the anti-imperialist movement around the world? It's we only ask easy questions here at Breakthrough News, except for when Manolo's on. Then we get really complicated.
It's
but yeah,
the easiest
I mean,
question and it's the hardest one.
Yeah.
It's a difficult question. I think it's a question that all of us have been asking us for the past few weeks, is how does an anti-imperialist progressive left around the world position itself around what's happening. I mean, as we see, not just the conflict from the point of view of Russia and Ukraine, but the conflict in terms of all the geopolitical stakes at hand. Where is the world going in this moment? Where is the new realignment of the ruling class globally? What does this mean for the US and EU NATO projects? I think these are all questions. And I think sadly for large sections of the anti-imperialist left, I think sometimes even with the best intentions and the best interest, have seen itself having to fall back on a discourse that is completely anti-Russian. Many times in order to not lose its base, in order to not lose votes, in order to not be completely isolated. I think it's a difficult position to have to be anti-war and anti-NATO and be focused on what the real contradiction is at base right now, which is that US imperialism and NATO, seen now as a global force, a global police force for the planet, is probably the greatest danger and the greatest menace to world peace. There is no likelihood for peace in any part of the world at this point. We have to remember that Colombia is an observer member of NATO. If NATO continues to play the role that it's playing in Europe, then we are foreseeing that our projects of integration, of unity, of independence, of sovereignty in the region are completely at stake. That any project of transformation in the region will be completely attacked, not just by the reactionary oligarchy of Colombia, but by this oligarchy and all its friends in NATO, in Europe and the US. The threat of NATO on the African continent, of what it would look like when the global NATO police force actually brings in more forces into the Sahel, brings in more military force to control raw and natural resources in the region, and to actually shut down any youth movement that questions the existing order on the continent. That is extremely dangerous for us. So the anti-imperialist left, in a sense, is in a moment of deep realignment, of understanding what its role and what its responsibility is and what its mission is, of remembering that class war is our objective above any national wars, remembering that we have a responsibility to the working people and the poor people of this planet who continue to die every day of hunger and malnutrition and lack of housing and lack of healthcare. We have to be reminded of the fact that COVID-19 has not ended and that less than 5% of Africans continue to not be vaccinated because of the policies of the global north and the vaccine apartheid that they have imposed. So in a sense, the realignment that is taking place even among the left is going to be one around those who continue to recognize that imperialism is the greatest danger to our planet, to our humanity, to its people, and all living things that inhabit it. Whether the left at this moment will be able to act on it, sadly, I think only a minority of us will be able to push forward this vision. It is, in fact, the most unpopular vision. To say that we are against war, to say we are against the greatest evil that exists on this planet is sadly an unpopular opinion, but is one that is filled with conviction, that is filled with principles, and that is capable of actually uniting those at the bottom, who are ultimately the people we care about the most.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. You know, it reminds me of, you can tell me I'm going to get it wrong, but that Fidel quote about the grandma where he started with small number of people. And he said, if I could do it again, I'd start with fewer people, I think was the quote. That the whole issue isn't that you need 1 million people necessarily, but that you have the right cause and the right purpose, even if you're a little isolated. That obviously worked out well for them. But it does seem like remembering some of those other tough moments historically that I think all transformative movements go through, right? Like a period of deep isolation as the world changes, that then of course is subsequently vindicated, that now is a good time to be lifting up those examples.
No, truly, this is not the first time that these type of realignments have taken place in history. It won't be the last either. And I actually believe that because of the coming together of all these crises that are taking place on our planet. I mean, the deep environmental crisis, the deep economic crisis, the fact that so many young people across the third world are facing a life with no future at all, no employment, no housing, no future for their children. This implies that there is also going to be a rising up of young people across the third world. And the real question for this anti-imperialist left, or those who consider themselves to be progressive, who care about the future, will be how do we align ourselves with them? Because that's the real danger and question of our time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Manolo, we really appreciate you coming and putting the questions of our time before our audience and everyone watching this. I guess everyone watching this is the audience, but nevertheless, I think important things to think about, a lot to grapple with, and a lot to dig into as people continue to act and not act as spectators. And just a quick plug I have to make, since you do represent the People's Forum, which hosts 1804 Books. Definitely want to plug 1804 Books. I think this is a time that we all need to be reading, learning, finding more. And I know that the staff there is working very hard to make sure there's all sorts of interesting stuff on these specific topics, and of just a fantastic range of things about just about everything, quite frankly. So 1804 Books, check that out. But Manolo de los Santos with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, as well as the People's Forum, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Eugene. Keep up the cutting edge work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to know somebody out there thinks that it's cutting edge work, Rania.
No, at least one person. At least one person thinks it's cutting edge. It's enough for me.
The pleasure is all ours. Well, before we close, Rania, I did want to circle back around real quick to the question that Don asked in the super chat that I thought was a good question, and maybe a good way to end. I mean, sort of, what is the best outcome now? What is possible? Does the U.S. really want peace? I'm sort of summarizing now, but, I think it's a good question, because it really, to me, it seems pretty clear that the best option and outcome, obviously, is for the fighting to stop as soon as possible. And as we said at the top of the show, it's clear how we get there. In these policies of turning Europe into an anti-Russia trench, essentially, and turning Ukraine into a pawn of Western desires to saber rattle against Russia, and talk about collective security. The things that were ignored that got us in are the things that, if they're recognized, can get us out, so to speak. There's a path in, there's a path out. But I thought the last question, I'm curious your thoughts about this whole thing, Ronnie, but I thought the last piece of it was interesting. Does the U.S. really want peace? Do they really want Ukraine to strike a deal? And I think that's a good question, because you haven't really seen anything from the United States, especially, that would give Ukraine some space to negotiate. I mean, if the U.S. made a full-throated, Ukraine's never going to join NATO, or, made some sort of statement about we're going to do XYZ, and we're willing to do XYZ, at least in terms of pulling back weapons, something that Ukraine could take to the table and say, oh, look, we can de-escalate this. That would obviously facilitate things. The fact that we aren't seeing that, I'm sure they're saying, oh, well, we're letting Ukraine lead. But we played that Hillary Clinton clip last week. I've seen a lot of people talk about this. Maybe they do want, sort of a frozen conflict, 10-year insurgency, Afghanistan-style thing. Maybe they view that issue of quote-unquote bleeding Russia as they viewed Afghanistan with the Soviet Union. I'm not saying that's their strategy, but it is interesting to see that there does seem to be not a lot of appetite in the West to open up space for these diplomatic solutions. And I think they're there for the taking. But like I said, we're at an inflection point.
Right. And I mean, I think that that's a really excellent question to raise, is does the U.S. want peace? Because, like you said, there isn't any sign that that's what the U.S. wants. I mean, does the U.S. want peace? They want what they consider peace on their own terms, which is oftentimes not peace for others. But we also have to remember the U.S. is the imperial power. It is a very militarized economy, where it literally needs war to function. Like, that's what that vast majority of the US economy lives off of, is war. And so it needs to, that's the market it's constantly looking for, right? It's more war. And so it's almost like, no, the US can't have peace in other parts of the world. And so in the case of Ukraine specifically, I mean, that's just speaking generally. In the case of Ukraine specifically, I mean, if we look at what happened over the last several months, where there was off ramps for the US that the US did not take. It refused to acknowledge Russia's security concerns. It refused to take any of them seriously. It pushed and pushed and pushed. And that's now we are where we are. And now that there is a war, the US is doing almost nothing to de-escalate it. It's doing quite the opposite. It's launched this horrible, ruinous economic war on Russia. It's continuing to push Russia into a corner, and it's flooding Ukraine with weapons and planning for supporting a years long insurgency. I mean, we saw, like, with almost no debate, within hours, the US Congress approved almost $14 billion of funding for Ukraine. I mean, they say it's humanitarian and military aid. It's likely more military than humanitarian, obviously. That's a lot of money, $14 billion. You can imagine how frustrated the Syrian opposition activists are to look at that $14 billion, because overall they got, I mean, at least on paper, they got about $1 billion over the course of several years. It probably comes out to a lot more than that. They certainly did not get $14 billion for the Syrian insurgency to overthrow the Syrian government. So just think about that $1 billion and how much damage it did in Syria, and multiply that by a factor of 14. Yeah. You can imagine the damage that's going to cause. And for years to come, I mean, that's not a sign of wanting any sort of peace at all. Quite the opposite. And at the end of the day, just like Adam Schiff said, we have to fight. We need Ukraine to fight Russia over there, so we don't have to fight Russia over here, whatever that means. That's what this is about. It's about sacrificing Ukrainians for a war that America thinks benefits, I guess, America's bottom line war industry, its hegemony, its power in the world. So no, that's a long response. The short response is no. I don't think the U.S. wants peace.
Yeah, well, I think the long response is very well taken, and I think very important. And, you know, the tragedy of this whole thing, in a way, is the fact that Ukraine has to choose, that there is some, you know, dichotomy between Europe, Russia, America, that there can't be good relations between all people, and we have to move beyond that mentality. But you also touched on a bunch of these topics in depth with Vijay Prashad earlier this week. I know you all were live, and the video is up on our Breakthrough News YouTube channel. So I very, very much encourage folks to check out Ranya's discussion with VJ that touched on a range of this and much, much more. And of course, subscribe on YouTube, hit the bell on YouTube, and you can also go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. That's patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Become a patron. All of your patronage, all of your support in any way is very, very appreciated by us here at Breakthrough News. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Hit subscribe and the bell on YouTube so you get the alerts. Follow us on social media at BT Newsroom on all of your social media platforms. There's the Dispatches podcast. There's the Punch Out podcast, both on Spotify, Apple Music, anywhere you find your podcast. So we're trying to be everywhere. We're going to be even more places. So follow us wherever you can. But I think that will do it for us this week, Rania. But as always, we'll see people next Thursday.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.